Again. I want to take a moment to welcome you all. My name is Warren Mabey. I am the director of the School of Policy Studies, and it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you to this installment in our Contagion Culture Lecture Series. This is a joint undertaking with other members of the Faculty of Arts and Science here at Queen's University, and we've been able to explore many different aspects of the pandemic and the implications that it's had for all of us. Before I get underway, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am sitting on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. Now, because we are virtual, it means that you may be on many different hereditary territories. You may want to take a moment to think about that. It is a privilege for us to be able to live and to work and to study on these territories, and it's important that we keep that in mind, particularly as we're trying to think about new ways of being and new ways of doing things. So I really want you to take a moment to reflect on that and to draw from that. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our guest speaker today. Professor Bob Watts is an adjunct professor and fellow, distinguished fellow here in the School of Policy Studies. He is the former CEO of the Assembly of First Nations. He is the former executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He has extensive experience working in administration, and we're really delighted that he's been able to take some time today to be able to speak to us. He's going to talk about the pandemic and the crisis from an Indigenous perspective. And rather than me talking, I'd like to pass over to Bob. The last thing that I'll say here is that as we go through, we will be using the Q&A function, which is found at the bottom of your screen, to collect questions. But we'd also like to encourage dialogue, discussion, ideas, suggestions. So whatever is occurring to you, please pop it into that Q&A function or into the chat function, and we'd be happy to talk about it as we get into that part of the series. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Watts. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Warren, and thank you for that kind introduction. Can you hear me all right? I really appreciated that land acknowledgement, and although it looks like I'm sitting right beside the mighty Grand River, which passes through the community I'm from, Six Nations, I'm actually in Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory, and we just want to honor the Indigenous people in this territory and to thank them for having taken care of this land in such a loving and beautiful way that we're able to walk on and inherit this, this land and work together in a meaningful way. So I was asked to pull together some thoughts about the pandemic and thought about that from the point of view of an ongoing crisis that's happening in Canada. And I'm not an expert in health policy. Most of my work is focused around reconciliation and around some of the administration of significant Indigenous programming and being part of lobbying efforts for change. Last year, I spent the year in Ottawa as Chief of Staff to National Chief Perry Bellegarde, working on some significant pieces of legislation and policy. And as Warren had indicated, I've had the opportunity to work on a few other pretty significant files. Warren, if you can pull up the next slide, please. So this is what I pulled together in terms of what I was thinking about in terms of this talk. Really about the difficulty that the pandemic has presented for Indigenous people, not just in Canada, but globally. Indigenous people have taken a variety of measures to protect themselves from the virus. I know in my own community at Six Nations, we just shut down the reserve for several weeks. you need to have a pass to come into our community. And it was a really bold and I think courageous decision. And fortunately, people got behind it in a big way, especially businesses. And many of the businesses in our community depend on people from off reserve to come into the community and be a buyer. So it was a big decision to do that. And we did it for several weeks. It was, ironic in some ways because at one point in our history as Indigenous people, we had to have a permit or a pass to be able to leave the reserve. In this case, folks needed to have a pass to be able to come on the reserve. So there's a little interesting bit of irony associated with that. The one thing that the pandemic has done also, and Indigenous people from one end of the country to the other, because of cultural genocide and what the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls characterized that history of and in an ongoing way as genocide, and healing from colonization. So this pandemic has reminded people of past trauma or the healing journeys that people are on, either as individuals or as families and as communities across the country. So it's had a bit of a multiplier effect in terms of pain and in terms of trauma. One of the things that we're seeing, and I'll talk about this a bit more, is how both the response from government, but the pandemic in and of itself has exposed cracks in Canadian society, but also in global society, in terms of how it pertains to Indigenous well-being, and globally, I think in terms of how it pertains to things like everything from the equality of men and women to the extremes of poverty and wealth, to climate change, to access to health. So these are things that, in my view anyway, that we've kind of structurally almost agreed that we're okay with those things happening. And we're okay with change happening at kind of a pace that's not dictated by Indigenous people, and pace not dictated by those who are suffering from poverty or poor access to health, but dictated by other systems and other governments. And this pandemic has shown the world these cracks in terms of how we've structured society and things that we just, I think, kind of take for granted in terms of the life and lived experience of Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous people here in Canada. And we've seen how that's been shown to inspire Indigenous people to protest against that, whether it's with the Coastal Gas Pipeline issue or with the lobster fishery issue on the East Coast. This inequality, this structural inequality, has come to the fore, and we all need to struggle through this. Next slide, please. I just want to make sure that we're on the same slide here. Yeah, you can go ahead one more, please, Warren. So, in addition to work that I do at Queen's, I have the opportunity to work with a number of governments and a number of corporations on Indigenous issues and reconciliation, partnership development. And what I wanted to read to you was a briefing note that I prepared for a board of directors of a corporation that I do some work with. So it says, these views that I'm going to present are informed by discussions with elders other traditional knowledge holders, colleagues, and my experiences. The crisis we are in is challenging the world in many ways, including political, cultural, economic, environmental, mental, and spiritual aspects, to name a few. Many Indigenous thought leaders have talked about this as a time of great change that was foretold and a time of renewal. Some have likened the crisis to Mother Earth scolding us for how we have treated her, and some speak of this as a time to reconsider how we treat each other and the Earth. COVID-19 has been referred to as a portal to another chance to demonstrate our ability to live in harmony with all of creation. There will be, and there has to be, radical change in the way we think, in the language we use, and in the way we treat one another, our families, and communities. How we restructure our social, economic, and political relations, how we treat nature and the environment, how we treat the four-legged, the water beings, the flyers, and the crawlers, how we treat the grandfather and grandmother rocks, how we treat the air, soil, water, and fire on Earth and all around us. How we address these matters will determine the new normal. The work that we're doing may receive a new assessment by communities based on how we will protect and respect the Earth. In many communities, this crisis is a reminder of past crises, and many people are experiencing trauma and grief. Deaths from COVID-19 will add to the grief and pain of historical and intergenerational losses. It will also remind us of the resilience of our ancestors and the spiritual gifts they have left us to help heal. We have built relationships and our reputation on being collaborative with communities. We stand out compared to many other private sector entities because of that approach. We have the opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to this approach by working with community partners and other bodies to determine how and when we will re-engage with those communities. Communities, individual stakeholders, and organizations that we typically engage with have varying priorities, resources, and may be impacted by COVID differently. It is important that engagement planning and implementation respect these differences in order to design a path forward. Respect for how communities might be responding, heightened stress, and feelings of powerlessness may impact communities, individuals, and the organization's desire to engage with us or change the tenor of conversation. Some communities may even experience a fear of allowing people from outside the community into their territory. We need to be aware that we may not be picking up from where we left off. Many of our partner communities will have undergone some profound change and may require time to process how that change should be manifest in their dealings with each other and with others, including corporations and governments, other governments. If we show up unaware of change and armed with the same tools we had pre-COVID, we will have a hard time demonstrating that we are sincere and a good partner. We could be taking time now to assess what has really worked for us and what we should leave behind as it no longer serves us. Answering the question with community partners of what is our new way to walk together may serve us well. Reconciliation may be a good tool to support some of these challenges and opportunities, to bring the importance of relationship, co-creating, spirit, and well-being to the forefront of these important discussions. We can ask some of the questions that our thinking on reconciliation has led us to consider. Some of the qualities which will serve us well moving forward may well be courage, vision, respect, caring, and patience. Part of our early vision as a corporation was to leave a legacy for future generations by demonstrating that by working together, we can accomplish and deal with very difficult issues. The many elders that we work with have assured us of their continued support and prayers in terms of moving forward. Next slide, please, Warren. So that was that was a piece that I wrote for a corporation that I'm really close to. And I put this slide up to remind folks of what the Prime Minister has said in terms of the importance of relationship with Indigenous people, and how that needs to guide government response. One of the things that I think that we've seen as we're moving forward is that many of these cracks that we've taken for granted in terms of society really are showing this idea of importance of relationship needs to be reconsidered, needs to be addressed in both a legislative way and a policy way, of course, but also needs to be addressed in terms of power sharing. It needs to be addressed in terms of poverty and figuring out a way of restructuring the fiscal framework in Canada so that Indigenous people benefit from the resources across the country, their resources, and are able to put structures in place, whether it's healthcare or other structures, to care for their own well-being. What we're seeing is some of these structural defects are exposing themselves. We see 1/3 of all First Nations in Manitoba, as an example, now are reporting cases of COVID, and Manitoba and Quebec in particular, Northern Quebec, looking for partners outside of government to help figure out how to respond appropriately to COVID. We're also seeing how some of the structural issues within communities that through the Indian Act have divided communities have sometimes increased divisions. And the pandemic has increased those structural divisions within communities that the Indian Act reinforces. So we have some big issues to grapple with. We have the fastest growing population in Canada, the youngest population in Canada, but from a mental health point of view, from a general health point of view, from an education point of view, from clean drinking water. I mean, all of these things that we oftentimes just take for granted in the South and aren't present in far too many of our communities. And I should be careful, it's not strictly a North-South issue. We see a lot of those same issues presenting themselves in First Nation communities and Métis communities, both on and off reserve in the South as well. There was a recent report that was released by Toronto Public Health, which again talked about how some of these structural issues are causing great harm. Said that 79% of reported COVID-19 infection cases were identified with racialized groups. 25% of cases are among Black people who continue to be overrepresented. 48% were living in households that could be considered low income. 25% were among individuals who live in households with 5 or more people. So we have some difficult issues to sort through in terms of the effect of the pandemic, but the effect in terms of life in general in many of our communities. Next slide, please. So we have this this issue, and it's been interesting. You know, some of the responses from Ottawa and from provincial capitals about how to take care of yourself in terms of cleaning and washing with soap and water. And then we have communities that not only have poor drinking water and no access to potable water, but we also also aren't even supposed to be in the water. And this is the life that far too many people are living. Some people are living generations under boil water advisories or having bottled water shipped into their community. The WHO explained and said that because Indigenous people are among the world's poorest and most vulnerable groups, they're at greater likelihood of contracting the disease. The WHO said, like other vulnerable groups, Indigenous people face many challenges. This includes a lack of political representation, economic marginalization, a lack of access to health, education, and social services. Indigenous people often have a high burden of poverty, unemployment, malnutrition, and both communicable and non-communicable diseases, making them more vulnerable to COVID-19 and its severe outcomes. So, and we see that playing out here in Canada, as well as with global people, global populations around the world. Next slide, please. So, so in terms of thinking about response, and we see this playing out, I think, really clearly in our neighbors to the south. I really like framing some of the leadership response in terms of adaptive and technical fixes. And what Ron Heifetz tells us is the single biggest failure in an exercise of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems, and therefore to apply technical solutions. Next slide, please, Warren. So here's some idea about technical problems, easy to identify. You can read the top 6 sort of definitions in terms of technical problems. And then if we look at the next slide, we have adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges really call upon leadership and society more generally to have to work together. So it's not the idea that something's going to magically disappear, or that by we can ignore problems and social issues in the hope that there's going to be a technical fix like a vaccine and everything's going to be good, because we know that's not true. We know that there's hard work that's required, and hard work in terms of leadership to be able to respond to challenges like a pandemic. And oftentimes we're not seeing that leadership, and we don't have the structures, the power structures in place that oftentimes allow community leaders, in particular Indigenous community leaders, to be able to talk about and to be able to speak up and to be able to access resources to be able to deal with health issues or underlying structural issues that make community members more vulnerable to a pandemic and to this ongoing crisis that many communities have been living for some time. So one of the things that we end up talking about is, we can go to the next slide, please, Warren. Is that this isn't a problem sort of just of the heart, although heart's important. It requires a different sort of imperative, a moral imperative to be able to act and to view all of these aspects of our social, institutional, community lives through the lens of justice. It likely implies a reordering of society more profound than anything we have yet achieved. So those structural gaps, those cracks that are more, we need to address those things. And it's going to require leadership, it's going to require courage and a new sort of moral courage to be able to deal with this. It is far more a profound challenge to create a new framework of justice. Our efforts can only succeed when we learn to build relationships with each other based on friendship, reconciliation, regard, and trust. And these attributes, these principles can become pillars in terms of, reimagining society and reimagining what reconciliation looks like. I try to think of reconciliation both as a lens and as a driver in terms of change in Canada. So we need some truth-telling to each other. We've heard truth-telling through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and through many, many inquiries, but we really need some very deliberative conversations about what we're willing to tolerate in Canada in terms of issues of poverty, in terms of powerlessness, and in terms of contribution to society more generally. And what are those structural changes that are going to allow those contributions to be able to manifest themselves? So it's going to require all of us to be willing to work together, to be able to listen, to be able to change. This pandemic and the associated crisis with far too many Indigenous people is really exposing deep economic, political, and social inequalities, as well as different aspects in terms of some of the solutions. We know that many Indigenous people really identify their own health and the health of their community with the health of Mother Earth. And so how do we take that into account in terms of economic, social, and environmental planning? If Indigenous people are right, and I think they are right, that the relationship of the health of community and the health of the earth go hand in hand, then we have some work to do in that regard. We have some rethinking to do and some reordering to do in terms of the voice of the earth, the rights of the earth, and how that's taken into account in terms of planning. Because there is that relationship between human beings and the earth. And there's no need to go into a lot about that. I want to just finish up. If you can go to the next slide, please, please, Warren. So there's this urgent need, and I think we've talked about this of transformative change with respect to things like the Canada Health Act, and I know it's tough to do all these changes in the middle of a crisis or in the middle of a pandemic, and we're throwing money at things to try to stop the trauma here and to stop the trauma there. But one of the things I think this is showing us is that's not sustainable over the long run. That we really need to think about those structures that need to be in place in Canada that really epitomize reconciliation and sort of the associated process of decolonization in Canada. And when I say decolonization, I'm not talking about anybody going anywhere. I'm talking about decolonizing some of those structures, the power structures, the constitutional legislative structures that allow the First Peoples of this country to live in poverty. And for the most part, except through protest, not to have a voice in terms of how development in and around their communities are going to impact on them. We're going to see those changes come at us, I think, over the next couple of years. The government of Canada is talking about implementing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and legislatively putting that process in place in Canada. They've begun that consultation process. That's going to create some profound change in terms of both legal and fiscal levers that Indigenous people should have and will have access to. As an Indigenous people, depending on the survey, if we were a country, we would rank anywhere between 75 and 89 in the world. Well, Canada, depending on the survey, is up around 8 to 10 and to 12 in the world. So we have this thing in Canada where we measure how we're doing, the Human Development Index. And I always thought that we were doing better. I was surprised when a lot of the data was analyzed over the last couple of years from the 2016 census. And what we found out in that 10-year period between 2006 and 2016, both for non-Indigenous people and for First Nation people in particular, things got a little bit better. for both. But the gap in terms of all those indicators from the Human Development Index actually increased between Indigenous people, First Nation people, and the rest of Canada. So, you know, we can think, boy, you know, we've made some good changes, you know, we've adjusted here and we've adjusted there. But in terms of how you measure it, we're still way behind. And those gaps have implications in terms of life outcomes for the youth, the frustration in terms of Indigenous people when they see how development is happening in other parts of the country and being left out of this. So what's being talked about is really to take not just sort of a equity-based approach in terms of healthcare in Canada, but really taking a human rights approach to and action on the social determinants of health to put structures in place that are based on the wisdom and knowledge of Indigenous people because they know what's best for their community, to try to create the opportunity for interventions based on the imagination of Indigenous people and their knowledge in terms of what interventions are going to work. Opportunities to put that in place. We need better monitoring, better evaluation of programs and services, and we need it to be co-created, and we need it to be led by Indigenous people. And it's not a practice that we're used to in Canada. So we have to change. That's part of the story of reconciliation, is to be able to sit back and recognize that the leadership that has been displayed by some of the institutions of Canada have been to the detriment and the ongoing detriment of Indigenous people. So we need to change what leadership looks like in terms of institutional response and government response. I just love this last slide. Many of you in Kingston and in other parts of the country, I'm sure know about Gord Downey and the amazing contribution that he made and commitments from his family and the Wenjack family in terms of education of Canadians, and in particular school-age people, in terms of the legacy of Cheney Wenjack and the legacy of Gord Downey. And one of the things that Gord Downey said was just do something. Do something that can help create change for the better. And so I invite you to think about what you can do in terms of doing something. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had 94 calls to action that impact on every part of life in Canada. So there's opportunity for each and every one of us, whether we're a university professor, whether you're a Little League baseball coach, whether you're the chair of the local Rotarians, or you're a member of government, or just somebody who wants to see a better Canada. There's a call to action for each and every one of us. One of the things that I think I'll just end with this thing, and we were at, when we were setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we invited folks from other TRCs from around the world to come and tell us about their experience and best practices and everything that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission may do. And one of the great scholars, Indigenous scholars in Canada, Paul Chartrand, he said, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are kind of like spring ice. And for me, spring ice and maybe fall ice are a little bit the same. Thought we might have actually seen some fall ice by now. But what he talked about was that fragility of that ice. Maybe you go out in the morning and that it might be a little ditch near your house or a little puddle or something. and you see that really, really fine ice. And what he said was that in order to hold up, to be able to pick up that ice, it requires people to put their hands together and to lift up that ice. And we can hold that ice up to the sun, and it acts like a prism, and it shows all these beautiful colors of creation, and they shine on all of us. And what he said was that that's what we need to do as a country, both for the TRC, and I would argue for the calls to action from the TRC, is we need to put our hands together and figure out ways of holding up those calls to action and all the love and moral courage and respect and care that's part of those calls to action, and hold that up to the sun so it shines this beautiful light, inspirational light on each and every one of us, so that we can work together to deal with these twin or maybe multiple issues that we're dealing with as a country, but in particular as Indigenous people living through a pandemic and a crisis all at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Watts, for your presentation and for your call to action. I think that it's something we need to hear and keep hearing. And I really appreciate you taking time today to come and to share your thoughts with us. We do have time for questions, and if you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you'll actually see we do have some questions up already. And I'm going to read them out, and then we can have some discussion. The first, I don't know who posted this, it says anonymous. The pandemic and Indigenous health, 4 major social determinants of health, income, education, employment, and housing. Among Indigenous peoples in Canada, the highlights include limited information regarding relationships and interactions, limited knowledge of factors contributing to current housing status, limited number of studies involving the barriers to and opportunities for education, diet and nutritional health. And then under nutritional health, and I think this is a follow-on question, so I'll just read it with this. The traditional diets and physical activities of Aboriginal peoples have been replaced with patterns of consumption that increase health risks. I won't go through everything there. And this has become a challenge. So there are some questions mixed in here and some comments. I'll turn to Professor Watts to see if you have any thoughts or reflections on what's being posted here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for those comments. My reflection on what was just read is increasingly there's a lot of good information out there that helps us sort through these issues and to be able to examine some of the structural and lived experiences in terms of health outcomes. At some point, as a society, we need to get beyond the need for every government to be able to say, well, we need to study that. Many of these things have been studied to the point where people are in tears over the studies, and what's required is action. And there's no debate from my point of view of how access to things like hunting rights and other treaty rights and lack of access to those rights and lack of access to natural foods, whether it's the moose, whether it's caribou, to be able to go out on the land, to be able to find the opportunity for both personal consumption and the ability to trade in terms of those foods is limited, and is being replaced by consumption, being replaced by welfare in some cases. Some of the incredibly important roles in our community have been replaced by social services. So these are, I think it's what the individual may be saying, I'm not sure, but for me anyways, it's kind of a call to action to ourselves too, in terms of how we think about our communities and how we kind of decolonize ourselves as Indigenous people from some of the worst parts of both the Indian Act and kind of our place in society and how we've responded to those structural inequalities. We can do more work ourselves too. So I'm not just pointing fingers at government and say, you got to do more. Yeah, I think it's true. As Indigenous people, we have the opportunity to be a lot more deliberate about many of these things as well.
Yeah, and one of the things you said in your preamble, you referred to the Six Nations basically buttoning down the community and requiring passes to get in. You know, this is really self-determination and governance that needs to be there, right? And you know, one of the things that I reflected on as you went through your presentation, you know, is this difference between the technical challenges and the adaptive challenges. And, you know, I think that for many of us, we're hardwired to think of everything in terms of technical. You know, how do we fill a gap? So if there is a food shortage, how do we get some money up there to buy some food, rather than maybe the adaptive solution, which is how do we get back to these ways of being that sustain people for so long?
Yeah, great commentary, Warren. I couldn't agree.
I'm learning a lot as we go, let me say. I have a question from Emily, and Emily writes, I read a powerful article about the history of plagues and illness from Europeans onto Indigenous communities, and how this has built both resiliency but also trauma around COVID-19 cases in Indigenous communities. How can the government support Indigenous communities with public health and science while acknowledging this long and painful history and acknowledging unique Indigenous healing knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Emily, for that. And, you know, I didn't go into great detail, but I alluded to that, how COVID is bringing up memories of past trauma and past pandemic, and how that can be so difficult for folks to be able to grapple with. Some communities have almost come to a halt in some ways because they've been paralyzed by fear and by the memory of historical trauma. You know, one of the things that Indigenous people have talked about for some time is the need for more and more to have Indigenous therapies being brought to bear on some of these issues. We have our own way of talking about healing that includes both physical, cultural, spiritual, and mental healing, all happening at the same time. And we've seen it happen in Canada. There was a number of centers that were set up to deal with the trauma of residential schools. And sadly, the funding for those healing centers was stopped by the federal government. But I think, you know, to respond directly to your point, this is where self-governance and self-determination with respect to health and healing practices needs to take place. Canada needs to create that space for Indigenous people to be able to practice those things. And we already have some good models in place in British Columbia, in Ontario, like I think of Toronto, Anishinaabe Health, and some of the amazing work that Anishinaabe Health is doing, both from a Western point of view in terms of dealing with maladies, but also from an Indigenous point of view, and sometimes interweaving both in terms of trying to find the best outcomes for people. So there's good examples. We don't need to be starting at square one over and over again. And we don't need to study it to death. We have some good examples out there that just require support to be able to increase the breadth and the reach of these Indigenous institutions.
And so I think that this is really so critical. You know, there have been these terrific examples of how Indigenous knowledge can be put to work to solve some of these deep, deep problems. And I think that particularly as we start to come out of this pandemic, there's going to be so many people that will be traumatized, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And there's so much that can be learned there that I think would help everybody, you know, certainly Indigenous communities, but beyond.
Okay, I can tell you as an example, Warren, one corporation that I do a lot of work with, we were saying, what, you know, given that we're working in this virtual space, what Indigenous technology, what Indigenous knowledge can we bring to bear on this that can be supported? We said, well, let's do a virtual talking circle. Let's have an elder in this meeting, and the elder can create a safe place through song, through prayer, through smudge, and imagining smudging everybody that's part of that call, and create that safe place for people to be able to just to be able to talk, to unburden themselves, and to be able to comfort each other. And so we've been doing that on a regular basis. So we do have those tools, those mechanisms to be able to help with some of these issues.
I think that they're really important, and it does tie into Edward's question. So Edward's asking, what are some of the specific measures that the Indigenous community, I think maybe we're talking about Indigenous communities, took in regards to the COVID crisis?
Yeah, that's it's a pretty broad question, but I can say that I'm not too sure what the percentage would be, but it would be a really high percentage of communities that basically just shut down. They said nobody's coming into our community, and we don't want anybody to go out unless you have to go out for groceries. But even some of the communities said, we're going to put in place structures so that we can bring more groceries into the communities, because not that many communities have like a supermarket in their communities. Either the population is too small or other reasons. So folks have put those things in place. Sadly, in some of the communities where there were already some fault lines in terms of resiliency and effectiveness in the community, the pandemic has increased those like they have in other parts of society. So there hasn't been a really strong sort of central response and community response. And we've seen, you know, to me, one of the really sad parts that we're seeing in communities is with our elders, because we've made a huge effort to make sure our elders are protected, both those that may be in elder residences, but those that are living on their own. But as we work to ensure that they're safe, they're also lonely. And they're complaining about being lonely. They're used to getting together to play bingo or to play euchre or to have elders lunch together. So this is having effects on that backbone of our community, the elders, because they are experiencing that loneliness. So, like, you know, I think it's been just tremendous, some of the responses that we've seen. The central principle, I think, has been how do we protect our people? How do we keep them safe? We've, you know, seen in our community, you know, early on in the pandemic, people were saying, you know, we need to start growing more of our own food. Well, the community responded. They said, well, we'll start up this seed bank. We'll start up we'll increase the food bank, but we're going to encourage people to be able to grow more of their own crops and to make accessible to people more of our traditional foods. And our leadership, I think, has responded really well as leadership in many other communities to put those safeguards into place, and but also to encourage people to find ways of becoming more self-sufficient at the same time. So there's a lot more gardeners in our communities than we've ever had. And also, I would say jokingly, there's more off reserve as well. I have a good friend in Ottawa. I don't know how much money they spent on trying to create a garden, and and they showed this picture on Facebook. They had about 6 potatoes, and he said these potatoes cost about $50 each, because that's how much money we put into our own little garden here. And but that's all we got out of it was like 6 potatoes. But you know, it's a response, and that's a good thing.
That is a good thing. We have time for one last comment, and it's Jamshed. He posts, you note the difference between technical and adaptive challenges. It seems to me that the biggest challenges facing us today are adaptive, things like climate change, social inequality, rebalancing the Indigenous Canada relationship. They're complex and require changes in the way we view the world. The challenge is, how do we actually move forward? We know the issues and we talk a great line, but are we any closer to actually making real lasting changes? He puts as an example the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. How do we concretely move forward? This is Jamshed's kind of question and comment.
Well, I'm not surprised that Jamshed put that question forward, and I appreciate it. And I would love to have a good chat with him about this to bring his experience and brain power to bear on this. But I mean, I think we are going to go through a period for the next little while of just you know, trying to fill the gap here and there. This issue is going to pop up, that issue is going to pop up. At the same time, it's my feeling anyway that there's a large part of Canadian society, and maybe we see this globally, that are saying, you know what, the status quo isn't serving us really well, and we need to make some profound changes in terms of how we relate to each other. And in some ways, the pandemic has helped increase that. I know almost in the evening of the week, I can get on a Zoom call or another sort of call with hundreds of people, maybe more, all over the world to talk about different issues. So that ability to find like-minded people to be able to work together with is increasing. Those barriers of distance, or maybe time, are being taken care of. But it is going to require part of creating a safe place to be able to talk about these issues and potential solutions is coming to that safe place and leaving behind some of those tools, many of which have been tools of oppression, and leave them behind. And to be able to come in and to be able to do something that, you know, part of adaptive change is to be able to co-design, be able to co-facilitate, you know, all these things that are cooperative in nature. By its very definition, I think it requires us to come together with a different spirit and a different intention. And some of that will happen in communities, some of that will happen in church basements, of people coming together. Some of that will happen in legislative committees, in Ottawa. And some of it will happen as laws are proclaimed in the Senate and with the Governor General. But the foundation is really a change in ourselves. We are the leaders, all of us together, as well as our families and our friends and our communities. Like we're the leaders, and we need to take our leadership responsibility in terms of, you know, some of the ideals that all of us think are really important in terms of equity and inclusion and respect for diversity. And in this case, reconciliation, and how that reconciliation lens is applied to all of those other levers in terms of moving us forward. So this is hard work. Like there's no easy way to get to an answer. It's hard work because we're talking about change, and we're talking about not moving beyond the status quo. And far too often we're comfortable with the status quo. If there's one thing that I think the pandemic is showing us, is for the most part, the status quo isn't serving anybody particularly well.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Watts, and thank you for your ideas, your thoughts, your renewed call to action. I'm so grateful that you're able to come and share these ideas with us and to bring this perspective to our discussion. I think that it's been incredibly useful, and I know from looking at the questions and the comments that people have really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for being here. For those of you online, thank you very much for taking part in our ongoing series. We do have another talk next week. Professors Xavier and Lee from Religious Studies and Kinesiology and Health Studies will be talking about a divine infection, religious communities, and the epidemiology of COVID-19. So please do tune in for that. Join me in thanking Professor Watts for taking time today. And I wish you all the best and good health over the next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the honor.
Thank you for
Stay
being
safe,
here.
everybody.
Yes. Okay. Bye, everybody. Take care.